right, well, thank you, everyone. I'll do my best to try to top that dance-off. I don't know if I'll be successful unless we get Bill up here to show us how. So real quick, I'm Joey Prast. I'm a partner at Deloitte. I focus on technology and life science companies, and then I help lead a few of our market offerings related to audit and accounting advisory services, specifically for digital health here in the Bay Area. So today we have a really great panel. I'll do a quick intro of the folks that we have here. So first we have Bill Evans, the CEO of Roche Health, who you just heard can dance a little bit as well. We have Lehman-Becker, and she is a senior director in Roche's digital and personal healthcare partnering units, and most recently, or at least relevant to this discussion, she helped on the Flatiron acquisition with Roche and Flatiron. So there's going to be a discussion of that. That's going to be really relevant to the conversation here. And then finally, rounding out the panel, we have Hylton Kalvaria. He's a senior principal at Flatiron. So they'll have a lot of perspective to be able to share on both of the buy side and then what it takes from a startup to sort of post-acquisition. And Hylton also leads the West Coast office and the life science team here locally in the Bay Area as well. So what are we talking about today? So I think we're talking about really exits and the M&A activity that we've seen in digital health and sort of the explosion of the investment coming from whether VCs or private equity backed, but we're not seeing the exits that you traditionally see in some of the technology or life science companies via IPO. In fact, we haven't really seen many IPOs in the past few years, but we've seen a high volume of exit by acquisition. So today we want to talk through, we're going to get a lot of discussion here on some of the examples from the Flatiron Roche example. Bill will be able to give some perspective from the venture background. And then as a reminder, I have the questions here, so feel free as we go through to ask your questions. So real quick though, I want to get some audience participation here first. Over the past 2 years, how many of you have either been on a company that's been acquired or been a company that has acquired a company in the digital health space? So just show of hands here if anyone, I know it's hard to see. Okay, so I do see a few hands, but there's also quite a few that aren't. So I think this will be a good mix of folks that have some experience in this space and who are able to learn a lot from the great panelists that we have here. So with that, let's just jump right in. So I'm gonna start with you, Lee, and really just give me your perspective. Given you where you are at with Roche, and we were talking in the back that you've been a part of many deals. What's your take on the current market of digital health and what we're seeing in the way of acquisitions, and maybe why we're not seeing IPOs? Just some thoughts on that.
I think actually what's interesting about digital health is what makes it easy to enter in some ways also makes it easy or harder to exit than you might find. So anyone can in their basement come up with a cool app and then try to get a patient or a provider to use it. But actually coming up with something that is, for example, acceptable to the FDA or to other health authorities, or can demonstrate really measurable, very rapid return on investment and be truly usable and accepted by the people that are doing this on a daily basis. That takes time and that takes a lot of investment that I think that a really small startup, it can be hard to actually raise that type of capital. And finding partners who have that ready flow of cash, can see the long term, can see the value of what you're trying to do with, say, digital endpoints or with patient data. Getting access to that is something that sometimes is an easier pitch to make to, say, an acquirer than going out into the capital markets or trying to do an IPO. So I don't think we've seen the end of IPOs. I think we're at a point, though, where digital health is evolving and where over time you may actually see sort of a pivot away from this acquisition-happy environment.
Yeah. I actually thought there was an interesting point made 2 sessions ago by Alicia about it's sort of related to this accessibility, how easy it is. That can also create a lot of fragmentation. So the quote was, how am I going to tell a patient that I'm going to prescribe 50 different apps for them? So part of it ends up leading you towards a place where maybe the best place for some of these companies is not to be a standalone company, but to be part of something bigger where we can actually start to integrate all these little pieces.
Got it. No, great perspective. So now, Bill, as you think about it, some of the data that you guys put out with Roche Health, you've seen sort of a peak of acquisitions, I think, in 2015, and it's sort of declining at a little bit of a rate, but there's still been over 600 acquisitions in the past 5 years just in the digital health space. What are you seeing, and why is this such a strong, what's so unique about digital health that investors want to continue to put in? I think we had a conversation the other day. I think it's over $32 billion in the past 5 years. So what makes these companies so interesting from the investor or venture side?
Yeah. What's so special about digital health? So that's true. There have been, as of this moment, I think we marked the beginning of time arbitrarily at around 2011 to now. It's about $32 billion, and it'll be quite a bit more than that, probably by end of Q4. So that's a lot of money. I think there's a couple of things. Investors are going to seek return first and foremost in this space. And I actually kind of want to make a point about that in terms of what a lot of the conversation about outside of the entrepreneur side, but on the investor side, is given all the money that's seeking return and the multiple that you'd expect, right? Multiply 32 billion by 5 or 10, and now you've got an output number of 150 or 300 billion dollars that investors, would want to see return of that sort over a 5+ 10-year perhaps time frame, depending on when you got in. And so I think there's a really interesting question about, you're just doing the math. Is that possible, right? And a couple of ways to look at, there's a bunch of ways to look at this and triangulate it. And I don't think anyone claims to have the answer, although some are putting a stake in the ground around one end or the other. But I sort of think about it in terms of what's the public market now, and you can kind of go out there and add up Fortune 100 healthcare companies, and you can come up with a total market cap of that. And then 300 billion is a pretty substantial number, right? If you're looking for another group of companies. The other way to look at it also is, I think in a $3.5, close to that $1 trillion healthcare market, what does it take to generate $300 billion worth of value? And it looks less intimidating then, given some experience with healthcare and what it takes to generate 10% savings in healthcare. That doesn't sound so hard, really. So the answer is, I think we don't really know. We don't. Right. It's still early in terms of what's the exit going to look like, but there's an awful lot of money going in.
Right. So I think this is a good segue now to sort of introduce the conversation of an actual example, and this is sort of one of the mega deals that we've seen in the recent time, but it also is a really good example of a large global pharmaceutical company that took on a strategic buy of a startup digital health company, and now that arguably Flatiron was a little more evolved in maybe where they were, but this is really one of the biggest deals that we've seen. And so we'll start out with you, Lee, and maybe just can give a little bit of background of your involvement of the transaction, and then really more importantly, what was so strategic, or from the buy side, what you're looking for really when you go to try to either maybe we can broadly say just partnerships, but specifically when you're looking at a potential M&A target as well.
This is one of those areas where actually having a track record with Flatiron really helped. So we had made an earlier equity investment that I actually was not a part of that deal. I came in later. But having that familiarity with the company and having, say, our CEO know Flatiron's founders, and actually getting to do research collaborations, getting to understand sort of how we saw the market moving together, knowing that we had similar enough cultures and that we had similar ambitions around personalized healthcare and around what could be done with patient data, with linking in genomic data. Having a little bit of that trial period made it so that when the opportunity came to us, we were able to go into it with more confidence. And we also knew that, to your point, this wasn't your average startup. There was maturity here. There was vision, there was infrastructure, there were all the elements that let us know this is not a fly-by-night concern, and this is something that has the longevity to really, for us to make the investment for a long-term play within this space. And my role was helping with strategic rationale, thinking through the actual steps, how would we structure the deal. And one thing I'll also call out that I think this might be a little bit unique to this deal is we actually structured this as its own entity.
Right.
We did not absorb Flatiron into the Roche family, and that was very deliberately in order to allow the innovation to flourish that was happening within that unit and within that culture and those people. And I'll let you speak to how that might have gone.
Great so far. I think when you hear Roche's head of pharma talk about the rationale behind the deal, it is so critical that Flatiron have that independence. If Flatiron were to be a sort of a single company entity, we wouldn't get that broad-based adoption that has been talked about already. So, initially it seemed a little bit counterintuitive to some of our other customers, and it took some convincing that we needed to be able to run separately. But I think there's pretty broad-based acceptance of the fact that Flatiron does have to run independently. And as part of my role, I'm a bit of the enforcer of which of the things are appropriate for us to be talking with Roche and which of the things are not appropriate. I always try to say, are we talking to them in the context of them as a customer, as a collaborator, or as an owner? And the moment it passes over into the ownership piece, that's where we end up having a conversation about should we be actually doing this? The answer is normally no, and we stop or go a different route. So so far it's been really great. Not much has changed.
I wanted to ask Lee a follow-up, because this thing about sort of like dating before you get married, it's not, I'm paraphrasing, of course. Was there anything that Roche did, Flatiron did, to structure that early getting to know you period that made it work? It clearly worked really well. Is there a lesson from that you would share?
I think having really measurable goals, like understanding, for example, where would we do research collaboration? Who on each side of the team would be involved in that? What did good look like? But then also making sure that our leadership had a very active seat on the board, as an example. And I think also the willingness to do some experimentation and to be transparent about sort of investment horizons and what we were working towards, that our combined vision was something that maybe couldn't get done in a year or two, but was something that we had worked out together for like a 10-year sort of vision.
Yeah.
That was very helpful from my perspective.
That's really long range.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unusual. I mean, that's differentiated, that kind of long range thinking in an acquisition.
Yeah, and I think
it's big value, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that part is absolutely key. The early experiments that we decided to do together, so much forethought went into that, and I think that's where the Roche leadership team deserves a lot of credit in giving us projects that, if they were successful, we're really going to set an incredibly high bar and prove the value of Flatiron. So we started off this process with 4, what we called stakeholder engagement projects. These were ones that were meant to go to a regulator, an HTA, a payer, some really important stakeholder who could kind of validate the approach. And not all of them worked, but a couple of them worked really, really well. And I think that proved, why this was a good relationship, and that has been sort of the basis for everything that you saw follow.
Yeah. I feel like this is the point where I have to do a disclosure, where, and I'm going to tell a story about Hylton in a second here too. But I worked. You can check it out on LinkedIn. I worked at Roche and Genentech before that, but. Hylton and I were in the first meeting that Zach and Nat took with Genentech at the time. And I don't remember who called it. It was either Charlie Barr, who's a colleague of ours at the time, you or me, probably you because of what happened next. But am I allowed to out you? So,
yeah.
So we walked out of that meeting, and this is why, so we walked out of that meeting, and Hylton turns to me and he goes, I'm working for the wrong company. And between the two of us, only one of us had the wisdom and foresight and inclination to actually go and jump. But I think some of that probably the early work on how to structure this, you sat on both sides of the table a little bit too on this. I was more of an observer, I think, on all of the stuff that was getting set up for Flatiron early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even before I left Genentech and went to Flatiron, there were early data deals that we did, and we intentionally structured them in a way where the entire Roche organization would have access to them, instead of saying we're just going to do something in this particular group. And that was a good decision at the time, because it ended up leading us to lots of other teams beyond where I sat in the U.S. commercial organization, who ultimately ended up being really big users of that data. Yeah.
Lee, maybe a follow-up question. So I work with a lot of the smaller digital health companies that get acquired that aren't quite to the scale of Flatiron, and maybe it's a little bit different when a company acquires them and is going to keep them as a standalone entity and sort of operate as is once they've gotten to scale. But I think a lot of the acquisitions sort of haven't been at that scale, and some of the strategic buyers are thinking of how that's going to complement their existing portfolio. And so maybe from your perspective, when you're looking at maybe a smaller deal and really looking to either integrate or where that smaller digital health company needs help in order to sort of get to that inflection point to run, how do you think of that differently when you're looking to target those type of companies?
I'm a big believer in pilots. Maybe I'm taking the analogy around dating a little too far, but I do like to get a sense of what people are actually capable of doing before I go and I do too much. And so I think there's sort of that balance between let's see what you can do, but also recognizing that Roche Genentech has the capabilities to help advance and mature companies. So I may find a technology and I'm like, this is amazing. It's not quite there. What can I do with this company to see if we can push it to the new level? And that might be, for example, access to new markets or access to regulators that maybe the company on its own might not have. And doing that journey together and seeing how it goes, and then having a frank conversation. Are you, say, the founder, the entrepreneur here, are you looking to come in and be part of us? Or are you looking to offload that technology and that IP and go off and do your next big adventure? And understanding what their desire is too, and their vision for their company and their material. So I think it's really about that openness, seeing what can this do with us and without us, and then how do you want to work with us as well, long term and short term.
So Bill, I'm gonna kind of pivot here to you on this question now. We'll go. You can
I chime in on one thing as well, just to what Lee is saying? So Rock Health and Megan Zweig and the research team did some great work around piloting and some do's and don'ts around this. I think piloting is almost a dirty word in healthcare because of the bad rep it gets around doing successive pilots without an endpoint. I'm going to paraphrase what I think the lesson here was. And this is what we published too, meaningful milestones and really clear endpoints up front, or don't do the pilot.
Yeah.
But that's definitely a path to value.
Okay.
Done
So
right.
kind of playing on that a little bit then is from the investor standpoint and sort of managing the difference between wanting to get a return on that investment at, whatever that inflection point is, and the determination of when does it make sense to make an exit, while still managing and balancing kind of the strategic value that you still want to create for patients and people. And so how do you balance that from sort of the investor side of, optimizing return on investment, but at the same time, taking into consideration what makes sense for the strategic view or the strategic path of that company?
Yeah, I think it depends on a bunch of things. I don't know if we have enough time. So how do you balance the return on the strategy and the outcome for everyone? So I think now the more common case in digital health. So I'm going to take a step back first, because it's less the case that a company is acquired by a major biopharma like Flatiron
Right.
for $2 billion. And much more, in fact. So by the numbers, digital health companies are the number one acquirers of digital health companies. And that's been true for the last couple of years. And I think we're 82 deals into this year, which is roughly on pace for the same number as last year. And it's actually the same signal as last year's digital health companies. So by and large, entrepreneurs, if M&A is a part of a valid exit, it's going to be most likely to be with another digital health company. And then there's sort of things to ask around that. Well, why would that be? And then the most common among digital health acquirers tend to be, in the population health management space, health EHR, some of the hospital workflow areas, and then there's kind of more data behind that. So I think that's kind of one thing just to think about. But I'm going to flip around and answer really quickly from the other point of view. And this is sort of a thing to think about as an entrepreneur. Your investors and where they are in their fund dictate to some degree, and in some cases, what kind of an exit you might get. And we've seen this with our portfolio. So we tend to be in early stage. We're very often first money in. to our companies. But a later stage investor who is at the end of their fund, let's say 5 years, 6 years into deployment, might be just as happy, might be indifferent between writing you down if you aren't, you're having a little bit of trouble fundraising, rather than backing you up, because signing another check out of that fund that they're closing down has a nice return, and the write-off is more valuable to them potentially than sticking around for another 2 years. Right. So I think there's a thing about the value to your investor, given who that investor may be, is really important too.
Okay. Interesting.
In terms of how you exit or don't.
Interesting. So we're getting a couple questions here. I want to jump to them a little bit. So Hylton, I'm going to go to you, and this is sort of around Flatiron's data and kind of the integration piece of it. So I know you're sort of operating as a standalone entity still, but is there maybe a strategic plan, and maybe both of you can sort of answer this, of leveraging sort of Flatiron's data integration with Roche's existing infrastructure, and even though it's standalone, how does the interaction and sort of life after acquisition, although it's, you said it's is there anything from that standpoint you can kind of share with the audience?
Yeah, I think we do have a broader data integration strategy, and we've seen a couple of examples of this already. Probably the biggest one is with us and Foundation Medicine, which is also another company that is now part of the Roche group. So that product is a combination of all the foundation testing that happens within the Flatiron network, plus all of the clinical data that we collect through the Flatiron network. I think you're much more likely to see that type of integration and linking happening, potentially with claims data also, than you are to see us link up with anything in Roche's systems as an exclusive thing that we would do with Roche alone. Now, lots of pharma companies have lots of data that they might like to have added and aggregated with Flatiron data. As part of a broader linking strategy, that's something that you might see us do. But I think linking back into Roche's systems that's a step too far. That's not something that we would do at this stage. Yeah.
If I can jump in there, I think that we also see that as something that needs to remain with you, and we see ourselves in many ways as your customer, your client, getting to tap into the data you have, but not controlling it or having exclusive access to it.
That's exactly right. Earlier when we were waiting, I was having conversations with our Roche counterparts about what they're going to pay for something. So, we still write contracts. They still pay for data. They don't get access to everything. It's very much a customer vendor in a way relationship. We do have some other collaborations, but they absolutely pay for things and buy things, and that's part of the deal.
Got it. So as an acquirer, you guys are being really careful, which makes sense because you spent a lot of money. What you must have learned those lessons somewhere, like how to do this and take such care. Are there any war stories, not naming names, or are there any lessons, without being specific, of course, about where you learned them, that informed this approach, where you kind of have this very segmented, very sort of structured way of seeing yourself as a client or a customer first?
I don't know that it's based on any sort of battle scenario or something that's gone wrong. I think it was more a recognition around sort of the evolution of how people think about patient data, patient privacy, and how that's going to change over the next few years, and recognizing that having a stance and a position that really says, we respect your privacy, we respect your data, and we're going to make sure that it's where you think it is as a patient and a provider, that was really critical for us. Yeah. But that being said, I think all of us in any MBA class or reading the newspaper hears about those integrations where you destroy value. And we wanted to make sure this was the, let's see what they're doing. Let's let them do what they've been so successful at already. And we'll have the conversation and the dialogue as that's being rolled out, as opposed to imposing our hand on it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So the answer, I guess, is that the biggest reason to have this approach is the nature of the product and the offering, and the need for real customer-facing perception of independence.
I think not just perception, but actual independence. And to that point, and I get a little tired of this particular analogy about the boats and the water and the rising tide, but a real belief that a lot of the things that Flatiron is trying to do with its variety of customers and clients, it actually does help all of us. And if Roche took that and made it a Roche-only thing, we actually were putting the brakes on something very remarkable that's happening right now.
Yeah, you can imagine from a regulator standpoint if they knew when I get data from Roche, it looks like this and it's validated in this way. When I get it from BMS, it looks this way and it's validated in this other way. Really, what we need, and the rising tide analogy is everybody coming with the same type of data. We set the standards. If others can meet those standards, also, they should, those data sources should be used as well. But everybody has to be coming with the same thing, and it's got to be familiar to the stakeholders that end up seeing it.
Interesting. So this is kind of weaving a couple questions here and kind of sort of relate to that, but maybe some of where maybe in the digital health space, now that you have a mega deal with Flatiron and the data capabilities that you have, is there a space particularly that you think that lends it more towards sort of the mega deal, or is it really just company specific and where you get it and what you see those needs are? So maybe open it up to anyone really here if there is a specific sort of runway that we're seeing evolve maybe faster than another.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the first stab at it. So I mean, certainly the mega acquisition deals of two of the biggest have come from one company. That's remarkable. PillPack's recent acquisition from Amazon may be more emblematic of things to come, in that non-traditional players are increasingly taking a role. We might not be able to call them non-traditional players pretty soon. And for them, it's a customer diversification strategy and business growth strategy. So healthcare is an incredible opportunity from the point of view of somebody who has a big and high touch customer experience like Amazon. So that's an important signal, and one that probably is more representative. Biopharma, I think, is going to be an interesting piece of the puzzle. Biopharma companies, I hope, are more keen to see digital health, and I hear, and what we've engaged with them around, is more keen to see digital health as a powerful way of keeping patients on appropriate therapies so that they achieve outcome. And that's a recognition that the competitive forces around many of their products, there's just more competition, generics, biosimilars, and so on, demand that they do something more. And whether that comes in a value-based reimbursements framework or not, they have to make cases to payers, whether it's fee for drug or fee for value. And that's driving a lot of interest from them. So I think that there are signals around these things, but I don't feel ready to make a prediction around a single vertical right now.
Got it. Maybe, Lee, from your perspective, looking at some of, do you find, maybe not a signal of what's going to be the next mega deal, but maybe on the upcoming of development, I don't know, I mean, we talked about you talked about some of the other ones there, but anything from your standpoint of what maybe from Roche's perspective, what you're targeting as being the next, up and coming sort of company that's needed in the space to really help develop and evolve?
So I don't know if there's necessarily like one vertical or one play here. I think it's going to be the next big either, mega acquisition or even the next sort of wave of smaller acquisitions. I can talk a little bit to the fact that we really get to the patient unmet need, the provider unmet need, the issues within the infrastructure and the overall healthcare system. And we think about how we can solve that or help contribute to making that better for everyone. And there is sort of an approach where you might have a lot of different shots on goal. Mm-hmm. And you may say one company can't do all of this, or even 5 acquisitions, but I can try some smaller moves with smaller companies that look at each of these points within the patient journey and see, do I move the needle at all? And I think one of the nice things about these relationships with smaller companies is, yes, you can do that with 10 or 15 companies. You're not limited to just one massive, massive deal and one massive company to do that.
What about you? What about you, Hylton, from your experience, maybe more from a customer side? Are they, the interactions that you're having with your customers, are they helping drive some of the new developments and some of the new, avenues that are being created by some of these new companies that are coming up? Yeah,
I mean, I think I was thinking back, Genentech had sort of a V1, or maybe it was already a V2 version of their digital health initiative. Almost all these companies have a version of a digital health initiative that they're looking at. I think those have evolved and matured pretty significantly over time. Our slice that we end up seeing is really about how they prepare themselves for real world evidence. And there's a pretty broad range of preparedness in that spectrum. You have a few that are really good. You have a few in the middle, and then you have a few that are just dipping their toe in. And I think there will be opportunities to help those companies get better at how they deal with real-world evidence and how they integrate it into their overall business planning and workflow, because they definitely need help. They're all not equal, and some of it is just a reflection of how long they've been working with real-world data, but there's plenty that can be done in that space.
Got it. Sort of, Bill, I'm gonna come to you here. I think there's been a lot of questions coming through again, but Lee, we kind of joked about this, the sort of the dot-com bust, and with all the investment, you mentioned about it earlier, and some of the indications, although these companies aren't necessarily in the public markets, is there an indication that sort of the market is becoming saturated with investment, and there is a risk of extreme pullback or a bubble popping? Maybe your thoughts on that.
We got the B word out there.
That's right.
I'm glad.
I got it a couple times. I had to bring it up.
Yeah, I think so. I'm glad. Well, one thing that I've tried to do is just take a step back and define the word bubble, right? And I looked it up in Merriam-Webster and tried to memorize it.
Sure you did.
Someone in the audience can shout it out for me. But the way I think of it is, valuation, the price of an asset is extraordinarily high relative to the fundamental value of the thing being invested in, like tulips and a long bygone era. And I was here in 1999 and in a startup, and man, that was a great Christmas party.
Yeah.
It was
I think I was there with you.
Yeah, right.
Was there a dance off there? Is that where you got it from?
Yeah, exactly. And not a single one of our portfolio companies has ever thrown, an extravagant, lavish Christmas party like the kinds of things that I saw and experienced then. So I think there's a real difference just in terms of the character and the kind of investment that's being done. And the other way to measure bubble that I'm alluding to here is capital efficiency. Mm-hmm. And by a lot of measures, we're more capital efficient. And by some, valuations are high. So I'm getting my things muddled here. Valuations are relatively high. I think I said that at the opening here on an historical basis in private markets. Money is being spent perhaps more efficiently than in the most extravagant of times, right? And then there's the total amount of money going in. And it could be that there's a large number of bets. So, right, there's value per bet, and then there's number of bets. That's multiply the two, you get the total size. The thing that I think I hear the most and that I'm most attuned to is that there's a large number of bets being placed. I think valuations is one thing, and the other that I mentioned. But I think that's the thing that many of us worry about the most is, okay, great, am I, as an investor, seeking liquidity on the other side of this endeavor, betting on something that is in a really very highly occupied space, right? And as time goes on, is that getting worse? Or is there a clear winner, or and so on? So I think that's an area to watch the most. But in terms of bubble, I just don't. By the definition and personal experience of bubbles, I don't see and feel that. I think that there definitely are good times and bad in any business cycle, and we're nearing peak good times. I'm quoting myself now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we're seeing it too from the data that we see. This feels a lot different in what this is actually doing from a need in the healthcare industry. It's not driven necessarily by maybe technology or something else that doesn't directly impact patient care and people. And so I think when we look at that, we don't see that this is going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
Like you said, there could be some ripples, but it's just interesting perspective on that.
Well, and I think we go through periods of experimentation and learning and consolidation of that learning. And sometimes that's actual consolidation of assets as well. But we've done a lot of learning. And if you go back, and we've published on this too, but you can look back at the kind of the uptick in funding in digital health, and you do the math. That cohort is actually small relative to just the last 2 years of funding.
Right.
So it's a fairly, in some cases, larger number of companies because they were smaller, earlier bets than the later rounds that are being done now and bigger rounds on later stage companies. So I think there's going to be a cohort of learning that goes with that cohort of early companies in digital health. And I think that's a sign of a healthy, maturing industry, frankly.
Interesting.
I was going to say, thinking back on those days, those late 90 days, I mean, there were companies that I couldn't even figure out what they were aspiring to do. And they really were there just to have a fast IPO, make money, and get out.
You did know my company.
As I said, I was at your Christmas party. And that's one of those things where I just don't encounter that. When I talk with companies now, it doesn't matter if they're small or if they're larger, and I say, tell me about what you do now and what you aspire to do, like there's a clear value proposition to at least one stakeholder. And that is, for me, a maturation that's really, really critical.
So now, Lee, I'm going to ask this question again to you, but beyond M&A, when you're just thinking about partnering, and we talked a little bit about that other than M&A, you're looking at partnerships and collaborations. How does that look different than an M&A strategic look when you're looking to buy them, either put them as a Flatiron, as a separate company, integrate them, versus just trying to have a strategic partnership and collaboration? Does that change the strategic view that you have and what you're looking for in a company?
Well, I mean, I think any time, with the exception of Flatiron and Foundation Medicines, where they actually are off, they're firewalled, but when you're bringing someone in, there is clear governance, there is clear decision making. Going into a collaboration or a partnership, you really do, to your point, have to have very clear understanding on milestones, inputs, outputs, how to pivot very, very quickly. And I think that that's one of those areas where I just like to make sure that I have the right people in that collaboration with the right expectations for how we're going to work. And it is a little bit of a different relationship, because you're not saying we're doing this for the foreseeable future. We can come in and we can come out. But I think that also can give you a little more freedom to do some pivots, or even say, hey, we tried this didn't work out. We can usually go off. So I think that the level of diligence we do is the same, but the sort of commands and controls we put in might be a little bit different.
I think that's a great way to frame it. I mean, that's also sort of after the fact of deciding, I assume, to kind of pursue an acquisition in a particular space. But I want to go backwards from that point in time. So before you know for sure you're going to acquire, it seems almost like from the founder or startup point of view, an acquisition is like a lightning strike, right? Like it's hard to predict. It's very hard. How would you know exactly who might be a good partner to go in and really court if they haven't already reached out to me as the founder, right? Is there a way to know? I mean, or is it just trying to like bottle lightning?
I was going to say, on the lightning analogy, I've had a few companies I'm working with where lightning has struck the same people or person 2 or 3 times.
This is a bad analogy.
And they're fried at this point with so many lightning strikes. But they know how to do this. They know how to find something that is a problem. They know how to find the capital around it, and they know how to operationalize it, either through partnerships or through finding innovative ways to get funding. And typically when I see you can do it once, I'm like, that's wonderful, can you do it a second time? And I am looking to work with those people more once they've had that sort of first proving. But we're very actively just landscaping, looking for the nugget of idea that maybe just we're not going to find through the people that have demonstrated success already.
So what can you give maybe some advice to maybe some of the younger startups here that are either looking for that partnership, and this can go to you as well, Hylton, or what they should do to prepare to be ready in the event that lightning strikes?
So I think it comes back to that the value prop story that you were telling. I think there was a time in within Flatiron's evolution that we were selling. We didn't necessarily have a great idea of how big our market could be. And I think what ended up changing about 1.5 years ago was we finally started putting a lot more rigor around where we think all this could be headed, and started telling a much better story about what the end game was. And for us, it was, how big is the real world evidence market? What we ended up realizing is that the story that we were telling was actually maybe even too limited. We shouldn't be talking about just real world evidence. We should be talking about how we can actually reach into trials. And how we can reach into areas where the spend is significantly higher. So I think having a little bit more rigor around how we forecasted, and that story that we could tell that was grounded in real numbers, was really, really important.
Got it. So it sounds like you really needed to take a step back and sort of almost broaden up your lens of what you were looking at, to just be able to show what you could create from, or where your value really drove, maybe, and where you weren't looking to prior to acquisition in order to get that there. So
right.
That's very interesting. What about Lee? I mean, what kind of advice can you give to someone that, again, is looking for that partnership?
I think looking for and knowing what you actually want to be your exit. There's a company I work with a lot that actually has structured itself as multiple peel-off companies and technologies. And this was interesting. They said there's probably not going to be one acquirer out there that wants all 5 or 6 of our technologies, but there's probably going to be a few that want some of them. And as we were interested in them, we were like, yes, we're interested in number 10, but not number 2. And they had structured themselves so that they could easily come into our organization. And having that ability to think long term and to make sure that we didn't end up with product number 1 and 5 when all we wanted was 5, I thought that was really, really smart. But that clearly was a group of people that had gone through that path before and knew what some of the pitfalls could be. But I think also I can't underestimate just the making sure you can work together. Going through an acquisition route is stressful, it's time consuming, but then also doing integration is also stressful and time consuming. Making sure you actually have teams that can be together. And if half of your team is wearing suits and playing golf and the other half is living a world of video games, just make sure they have something that they can work towards.
I think there's also, knowing whether the timing's right in terms of have you reached exit velocity in a way where you have an idea, maybe it's not fully self-sustaining yet, but you see a path to it being fully self-sustaining. Because even in a scenario like this where Roche has said you're an independent company, you need to operate alone. In our example, because we are trying to keep other competitors' information private, it actually started to lock down how we communicate internally. And so you can already start to see those innovation cycles slow down a little bit. We're a larger company, we're part of a larger company. It's just natural that's going to happen. If you haven't actually hit that point yet where the business is going to be self-sustaining, you may find yourself in trouble afterwards.
This is going to be kind of a broad question, but maybe just what are you most excited to see in the evolution over the next maybe year? You want to chime in on that, please?
I was going to jump in.
Please.
I actually think differently. I think that, so flipping it around from the acquirer point of view, that all makes sense. I think that founders should just focus on creating value and that they should work within a strategy that has multiple possible good outcomes. But I just think really focus on creating value and work closely with your board and your investors to make sure you're on a strategy that has potentially great outcomes. And the one thing that we haven't talked about is IPOs. That was the other word other than the B word I was expecting to hear.
Well, that's right. So maybe you can give your perspective on maybe really more importantly why we're not seeing IPOs, or do you think that that's going to actually start coming down as this market matures a little bit and you see this consolidation happening? Can that foster more IPOs or an opportunity for IPOs to occur more optimally than they've occurred in the space?
Yeah, and I jumped in to try to get that in because I think it relates to this question about exit broadly, right? And what should you focus on? Right now, for the past 2 years, there have been 0 IPOs in digital health. It's such an easy number to remember.
I think there's one in China, but that doesn't
right.
really count.
Yeah, but I think context is everything. So that's a low number, no matter how you can't have a negative number, as it turns out. So the number of IPOs broadly is down, and the number of listed companies in the U.S. is low on a relative basis. It's about half as many as it was in the mid-'70s.
What's interesting, right? You say that of the Fortune 500 companies of 20 years ago, less than 40% of them exist today.
That's right.
So anyway, sorry to interrupt, but it's a stat that this consolidation that occurs even in mature markets and listed companies as well.
Right, and if you plot the Pareto of rank companies by size, the Fortune 500 occupies a larger percentage of the total market. I actually don't know off the top of my head, but a significantly larger percentage. So value, or at least valuations, are consolidated and crowded into a smaller number of companies. So I think it behooves us to think and be really mindful of what does that mean? Well, it means that acquisition is more common.
That's right.
On the whole, it's more common, and it's more common as a liquidity event for an early stage company. I think that would be the main point I would make. We're going to have some really interesting IPOs in tech, hopefully in the next year or so. It sounds that way, but the market sort of bouncing along puts some of that into question, so we'll see.
Well, it's interesting too, because we see that there's just a more opportunity for private companies to get other avenues of funding where, if you rewind the clock 10 years ago, the IPO was really one of the main ways that, one, you could get liquidity, but you could have access to capital. And with some of the new ways to actually access capital as a private company, sometimes the need to go through and be a public company aren't as needed, and that's why I think we're seeing more M&A, less desire to just have the IPO as this is my exit strategy and that's all I'm going to look to. I think people are really broadly looking at what makes sense, and to your point earlier, I think you're getting people, especially in this space, that are looking at sort of value and what they can, where do they want the company to go versus just an exit strategy in a singular point.
Bill, do you think it's the case that if some of these companies had not been acquired, they would go public, or this was going to be the right exit for them regardless of timing?
That's a good question. There's about 120 exits a year, 0 IPOs. So, I think it's unlikely that any of the digital health companies that were acquired would have made it to the public market, just by the numbers for now. But I think that's also because, and this is another kind of background data point, of the couple dozen that have over the last 7 years or so, it took them about 10 years to get to the market. And we've been counting new digital health companies since 2011, and the ramp is pretty steep. And it hasn't been 10 years since 2011, at least when I do the math. It's only been 7. So sort of mathematically, we shouldn't expect to see a huge number yet, but 0 is still low. So to your, right? And it turns out about 10% of companies in digital health, 120 is about 10% of the total number of companies in digital health, at least the total number that have received, when we count it, $2 million or more in total funding. So we have a threshold for significance on that. So 10% of those companies are acquired every year, roughly, give or take, right now.
That's interesting. All right, so we have a couple minutes left here. Maybe in about 30 seconds, I'll start with you, Hylton. Maybe just, what's your 1-2 takeaways, just from the overall exit market, and then maybe even specifically related to, your experience with Flatiron? Just maybe a quick 2 takeaways that you want to leave the audience with.
Sure. I think there are a lot of businesses that we're seeing within digital health, and the one thing we haven't said so far is digital health is really, really broad. There's lots of different ways to define it, but within our small part of the digital health market, I think that there often end up being 2 pieces to the business. There's sort of the installed base. There's the software that you want people to have. There's the app that you want them to have, and then there's all the data. And I think the install base and the growth of those numbers is really easy to measure and value. I think the data is really, really hard to measure the value of. And I think in Flatiron's case, you can count up the number of seats of Onco EMR, which is our EHR platform, but how do you value being able to bring a BMS drug to market a year faster, and how much of that value are we going to capture? So I think this is part of the reason why I think we're seeing a lot more M&A activity and strategic M&A activity, because the company doing the acquiring is much more easily able to see the value of the data part than the capital markets are going to be able to, the public capital markets.
All right. Lee, quickly, what about you? Maybe one takeaway here.
I was really struck by your concept of just drive to value. And I think that, your story about Flatiron had one vision, and then they realized maybe we're not thinking big enough, and suddenly their value, both in their own eyes and in the eyes of people out in the market and potential acquirers, really changed when there was just a little shift in focus and a little shift in what can we do with our current assets that might have a new place out in this marketplace. And just having that ability to step back and look for that new element or that new interpretation of your potential, I think could behoove everyone.
Bill, your shot here.
Yeah, I think fundamentals are what matter, right? And fundamentally, healthcare is still in desperate need of technology-based solutions. It's in need of a number of other things too, but all I have is a hammer, right? Yeah. So I see the world. I see that opportunity. That part of the opportunity is still tremendous, and I think that some of the things that we're talking about right now are going to come and go, right? But the fundamental problem remains, and the fundamental economic value, the outcomes that we can drive for patients remain, that opportunity remains. So I think that's the place to stay focused, and the rest of this is going to come and go. And we alluded to the dot-com bubble, coming and going too. I lived through that, and man, the traffic was great on the 101 in 2003 if you were here. So there's an upside to everything.
Right. Well, so this is fantastic. Thank you, everyone. I think, as we see that, M&A is certainly not going away, and it, from everything we're hearing from the panelists here and what we've seen in, your research, our research, strategic buyers are still going to be the main focus here. Big pharma, they have a lot of ability to deploy capital, and they're finding them in ways that can integrate and use the space to help project those companies. And I think, like you said, it's focus on care. Or where the strategic play is for your individual company, and I think that'll show long-term success. The industry is not going anywhere, like you said. So, anyways, I want to thank everyone for your time, your panel, and I think that concludes this session here. So,
great,
thank you.